Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest property and infrastructure briefing from the British Chamber of Commerce. And today I'm delighted to have Marcus Burtonshaw, the Executive Director and Head of Commercial Agency at Knight Frank, Thailand, who's worked in the property sector in Thailand for the last 18 years and is many years ago former colleague of mine. And I think he's one of the most knowledgeable people in the business about the Thai industrial property market. So I'm looking forward to what Marcus has got to say today on what is essentially one of the most important things to the Thai economy, because foreign direct investment in manufacturing has been a key driver of the Thai economy for the last 30 years. And it's suffered a bit recently. So I'd like to see what's happening, particularly as now the other driver of the Thai economy, tourism, is dead in the water. So let's see if what Marcus has got to say, and hopefully there might be a little bit of good news out there in a market that has been, the rest of the property market, which has been reasonably gloomy. So over to you, Marcus.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to share my thoughts with you all today. So without further ado, we'll get straight into it. Okay, now hopefully you can see my presentation and we can go forward. So I think we will start the presentation with some context, talk about the various areas that we're going to be discussing. Actually, the talk today is going to be a little bit more focused on logistics. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So the sort of major logistics regions, I think if you've been aware of the sector, I mean, first of all, we would look at the National Distribution Hub up in Wang Noi and Pathum Thani, the area, of course, which was devastated by the floods in 2011. Then we have what we would say is a commercial hub in Bangkok, the real sort of economic heart of the country. Then what we describe as our general distribution hub, Samut Prakan, Chachoengsao. So a mix of logistics-oriented activities geared towards consumers in Bangkok, and well as a mix with industrial operators. Then export distribution down into the EEC, close to Lanchbang Deep Sea Port. And then, of course, there are, other specialty logistics hubs, such as petrochemical down in Mataput. And again, there's food going out towards the west in Samut Songkhram, Samut Songkhon. But the vast majority of our statistics will be focused around three key regions. The central region, Ayutthaya, Pathum Thani and Saraburi. Bangkok Metropolitan and its surrounding provinces, including Samut Prakan, Samut Songkhon and Saraburi. And the EEC, Eastern Seaboard of Chachoengsao, Chonburi and Rayong. So, quick look at the overview of the stats. And if you were here at my talk last year, you will note that not all that much has changed. Supply has increased by just about 2.5%. And with it, so has occupied space. Occupied space increasing by 2.3% over last year, up to about 3.9%. Occupancy rates ever so slightly down at 83%, but really, I mean, that's been that level for the last 3 or 4 years or so. And rents have barely moved, slightly increase, about 0.5% or so, but for all intents and purposes, pretty much the same. This, of course, leads to a rather gentle graph with occupancy rates bouncing around 84%, going back to about sort of 2018 or so. And you can see here quite clearly that supply increases ever so gradually and pretty much in line with demand. And that's partly as a result of a nature in which the development has shifted towards built-to-suit solutions as opposed to speculative development, which is more common in other sectors. So where is it all? Well, the vast majority is in that Bangkok metropolitan region, Bangkok, Samut Prakan and neighbouring provinces, accounting for about 46% of total supply. Nearly 1.7 million, or 37%, is in the eastern seaboard. And today, the northern area, Wang Noi, Ayutthaya, is just 16%. It's quite interesting to see how that distribution has changed over time. If you look at the central region back in 2011, you can see that the supply distribution at that time in that area was 26%. And we now see that the developers are obviously moving away from that location, focusing on Bangkok and the eastern seaboard. And we expect that trend to continue in line with demand, where obviously people are much more focused on the Bangkok and eastern seaboard areas. Over the past year or so, there's been a lot of news and noise, if you like, about just how successful perhaps the logistics sector has been. And it has been to a degree, but it's certainly been subdued. We can see here that overall annual net absorption, while still positive, over the last 6 months, it's only seen about 38,400 square meters of net absorption. We expect that to increase over the second half of the year, but it's still got a little bit of way to go before we reach to pre-pandemic levels. I mentioned briefly about popularity, and this clearly shows with our occupancy rates at 90% in the Bangkok metropolitan region that this is definitely the most popular location, whereas we see the eastern seaboard just 76%, and that's partly, I think, related to how the supply chain for companies in the eastern seaboard is oriented towards exports. Now, of course, if you have your factory in the EEC and you're down in Rayon, you don't have quite so far to go to the deep sea port. So given that there isn't going to be any need for your goods to stop moving between the factory and the port, there's not really all that much need for warehousing. And as a result, we don't see quite as much popularity, although it is beginning to increase as areas like Chachoengsao become increasingly important to logistics property. Rents, well, a rather stable, bouncing around about 156 to 158 baht per square meter over the last 5 years. Ever so slight fluctuations, and these are averages, of course. The spread varies quite considerably. There are certainly buildings in the Samut Prakan area where you're going to be able to find modern distribution centres at 120 or 130 or even 140 baht per square metre. But if we look on average, we're looking at about 160 baht per square metre in the Bangkok metropolitan area, despite that being the most popular location. That causes challenges, I think, for developers in that area with rising rents. So we're starting to see some yield compression in that particular region. The who's who of this sector has not changed, of course. It's WHA and Frasers, still very much a two-horse race, representing about 59% combined market share. And these players are increasingly focused on the build-to-suit solutions. And today, that, of course, means being geared towards the e-commerce sector. The e-commerce sector and logistics go hand in hand, so I think it's appropriate for us to look at the e-commerce sector in Thailand because of the impact it is having on the Thai logistics market. Rise Corporate Innovation Powerhouse showed that in 2019, total value of e-commerce sales in Thailand was 5.2 billion baht. That grew by 35% from 2019 through to 2020 to 7.1 million baht. That's according to Rise Corporate Innovation Powerhouse. If you were talk to some of the e-commerce players, they'll give you some slightly different numbers. I think Lazada recently mentioned in their press release that they saw the combined total sales, or looked at the value of the e-commerce market in Thailand last year being closer to 10 billion baht. Instead of that, they were experiencing something like 85% growth. Well, whatever it is, we're seeing a very large number. It's certainly looking at double-digit growth. And we think that's likely to continue. There's a lot of headroom. If we look at the total percentage of e-commerce as a total retail sales, in Thailand, that's just 4%. whereas compared to China, it was 33% of total retail sales is now on e-commerce platforms. And even the conservative Japan at 9% still represents a much bigger share of the market going towards e-commerce as opposed to the traditional brick and mortar retailers. So this growth in e-commerce represents there are a number of trends that are attached to e-commerce which are emerging. And one of the major issues I think that e-commerce platforms have, I mean, not only do they have incredible growth, but they also have what we could say a last mile problem, getting goods to customers as quickly as possible. Two of the top three reasons for shopping cart abandonment relates to logistics, too high shipping fees, and too slow delivery times. In a recent study, something like 57% of consumers said that Amazon Prime's same-day, next-day delivery service increased how much they spent on the platform. Getting last-mile facilities, so you have your regional or your regional distribution centre serving Bangkok or large areas, and now we're looking at smaller sort of satellite last-mile facilities coming into urban locations. There's plenty of challenges attached to that. I think last year we talked about how there might be new types of warehouses emerging to help to solve that issue with respect to like ramp up or multi-story warehousing in more traditional urban locations. And there are indeed some plans for some facilities like that in Thailand. Other trends which have rise to prominence in the region as a result of this pandemic has been the demand for fresh and frozen food. Now, and this has led to a spectacular growth in the field of cold chain logistics. Just this year, several firms have announced their intentions to expand into this sector. Kerry Express plan to launch their service in the second half of this year, following a 500 million baht expansion of E.S.G Nichirai logistics facility in December last year. And just last week, on September the 1st, saw the official launch of Fuse Post, a new joint venture between the Thai Post, Flash Express, and JWD Info Logistics, initially serving commercial clients like restaurant chains and the emerging cloud kitchens related again to this e-commerce growth. But eventually they will be moving into the B2C market, helping to provide solutions for people like Foodpanda, Grab, etc. So the e-commerce then is I think is leading to not only growth in cold chain logistics, which has of course is nothing new, but also new fulfillment models. We're looking at in markets around the world, we're starting to see what we call micro fulfillment centers, or we would probably describe them as sort of mini warehousing. So really these are warehouses of about less than 1,000 square meters, packed with technology, looking at so they're able to provide a solution for the last mile problem, and also to help with returns and reverse logistics as companies move to try to capture some of the value in as they move towards a circular economy. The sector's resilience and those boring graphs, I think, have led to, I think it's perhaps been one of the areas, one of the sector's most attractive aspects or features has been its resilience, its and the growth potential that it's attracted players from not only overseas, and we're starting to see major international developers looking at Thailand, but we're also beginning to see developers from other sectors of residential, such as Sansiri and Origin, who have formed joint ventures with logistics solution providers, and they're now looking at developing a well over 200,000 square meters of space. But I think that if we were to cast our eyes to the future a little bit and looking at trends that not only going to become prevalent over the rest of the year or even next year. I think one of the things will be this emerging and greater focus on ESG. ESG is, of course, the environmental, social and governance considerations, which have become increasingly incorporated into policies, corporate governance, frameworks and investment decisions of major financial institutions. ESG concerns have really entered the centre stage. The 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer surveyed 600 institutional investors with assets totaling $20 trillion and reported that 96% of their respondents planned on deepening focus on ESG during the COVID-19 recovery period. And for a growing number of multinationals, ESG-related KPIs are now even linked directly to executive pay. In Thailand, ESG-related issues, I think, have long been set aside, but we believe that times are changing. In 2021, the SEC, the Stock Exchange Commission of Thailand, has introduced the One Report requirement, which combines the annual report and the annual information statement, in which the topic of CSR has been replaced by Business Development for Sustainability, which is an elevated level of sustainability disclosure, in which firms must share strategies, goals, targets, value chain issues, as well as their environmental impact. In fact, the Thai Sustainability Investment Index, or SET-THSI, rose by 16% between the end of December and May, beating the SET, which rose by 13% over the same period. And it's not just at an institutional level. Consumer habits are also changing. In June this year, PricewaterhouseCoopers published their Global Consumer Insights Pulse survey, which canvassed consumers in 22 countries, including Thailand. Nearly 80% of Thai consumers surveyed said that they have become more eco-friendly when purchasing products in the prior 6 months. The number of Thai consumers deliberately purchasing eco-friendly packaging rose to 76% in June, up from 74% in the same survey in March. So things, I think, have changed quite considerably. And, I think that real estate sector, we have a role to play. According to the United Nations, the built environment is responsible for 30% of greenhouse gases and consumes about 36% of world energy. To meet the Paris Agreement, by 2050, all buildings must be carbon neutral. Yet today, not even 1% of buildings meet that standard. So this sector clearly has plenty of scope to improve and help firms to improve their ESG-related goals. In the logistics property sector here in Thailand, there are now some excellent examples of eco-friendly warehousing, with solar panels on rooftops, LED lighting with motion sensors, rainwater harvesting, and improvements in the efficiency of utility consumption. We can see here some examples of some excellent efforts and great strides which have been taken in the ESG sector by the Thai logistics sector. DHL announcing that they're on track to meet zero carbon emissions target by 2050 in Thailand, after having installed over 11,000 square meters of solar panels on rooftops across 4 of its warehouses at its Bangna logistics campus. In June, Fraser's Property announced the completion of a 74,000 square meter build-to-suit development, adhering to FN Global Standards, GMP compliance, and certified LEED Gold. And it's not just the big guys. Triven Group TAA1 project, 22,000 square meter green warehouse development, launched in 2015, certified LEED Silver, uses nearly 15% less energy than typical warehouses, and water-efficient plumbing fixtures save 42% over typical consumption and recycled content. And then we have WHA, where Soraburi Industrial Land received Thailand's first Green Industry Award under the 100% Green Industrial Estate category from the Ministry of Industry in 2021. And our image to the right shows Thailand's largest solar car park with 4.8 megawatt capacity at the MG manufacturing plant in Rayong. But looking ahead, I expect that these features will become par for the course, rather than merely exceptional examples. The challenges ahead for developers will not be those related to management, or of designing buildings to be even more energy efficient. It will be with upgrading or decarbonising their existing inventories to ensure that they don't fade into obsolescence, and making sure that their own supply chains are compliant with their own ESG goals. And that is the end of my presentation. We have focused on the logistics, but I'm quite open to take questions on logistics or manufacturing.
So if anyone has any questions, please would you be so kind as to enter them on the Q&A section, and then I shall read them out for Marcus to respond. Maybe I'll just kick off with one question, Marcus. Considering all the talk about e-commerce, and certainly it's been turbocharged during the lockdown periods, how come unlike the rest of the world, the demand for modern logistics, the take-up rates still seem relatively tepid here to what we're seeing reported in the press in more mature markets like UK, US, Australia?
I think that, we don't have very many operators, I think, primarily, number one. Okay, so we have Lazada, Shopee, and there's a few more which have warehouses of any sort of sufficient size. So I think probably total number of operators which are in the market would be probably a reason for that. In fact, if you look at the people like Shopee or Lazada, they have been growing quite considerably. With several new sort of warehouses which have been built to suit for, say, for example, for Shopee over the past year, 60,000 square meters, 50,000 square meters, that sort of range.
Thank you. And just while we're waiting for other people to come on with questions, maybe I've got one on the industrial market, and just on, to some extent, it feels that Thailand is losing out on foreign direct investment in manufacturing, which has been a major driver for the Thai economy since over the last 30 years that I've been here. And we seem to have been eclipsed to some extent by Vietnam. And with a lower labour class, and a lot of assembly jobs have gone there, and Vietnam seems to have got the lion's share of relocation from China, either because of tariffs or because of high labour costs driving that relocation. So why do you think Thailand is lagging behind? Is it high labour costs, or is it another reason? And what other reasons are there that demand has been, land sales have been so low?
So I think that, Thailand's, I think, no longer that cheap. As you mentioned, I think labour costs, for example, have increased quite substantially over the last sort of 10 years or so, with the introduction or the sort of national minimum wage hike, which happened about maybe it was about 10 years ago. So we started to see decline there. The Board of Investment pivoted away from low-cost, labour-intensive manufacturing, which I think is what Vietnam is primarily attracting, or has been attracting. So the incentives for that type of manufacturing is just no longer there. I think Thailand is trying to move away from that type of manufacturing work, arguing that they want to escape this middle income trap and sort of focus, if you like, on higher value add manufacturing. But it still has some work to do on there. I think there's still a number of issues. I think land values are actually quite high, which makes the overall investment actually seem quite high in comparison, especially if you're comparing with markets like the Philippines or some of the others which are attracting this sort of low-cost, labour-intensive manufacturing. And I think the other reason, I do think that there is still quite a lot of pent-up demand, but travel restrictions have really restricted the ability for manufacturers just to simply come and actually inspect and actually complete transactions. We know that there's quite a lot of pent-up demand from China, who are waiting in the wings to come, but are unable to visit yet.
Thanks, Marcus. Right, the questions have been rolling in fast and furious. So I'll kick off with the first one from Ian Kavanagh. And his question is, how does the current level of speculative build by developers compare to previous years? Or is it more build to order, build to suit?
Yeah, it's primarily build to suit. So I think the vast majority of new logistics parks now are almost entirely build to suit or geared towards that. They too tend to have some element of speculative development in there. So for example, that's really geared towards trying to retain tenants in the long term. So they will build, say, a 30,000 or 20,000 square meter shed for somebody on the initial term, and then they might have, say, a 10,000 square meter speculative development or speculative building next to it, which might be able to accommodate their future growth. So I think it's certainly a lot less than it used to be. In the past, it was almost entirely speculative.
Okay, so there's less risk in the sector for developers. If you're building to suit, then the main risk is that, just in case the company goes bankrupt, that's the main risk, or you can't find the land where they want to be. So John Rounds has asked,
getting the land at the right price.
John Rounds has asked, what are Tesco, CP Foods and Mancro up to? New investments, reorganisation of logistics? Do you have any idea on that?
Not aware of what they're doing recently. I think I do remember being at a talk with Tesco's a few years ago, who in the wake of the floods announced that they had changed their distribution strategy, whereby they no longer 100% reliant on the distribution centres in Wangnoi. They decided to sort of have a more of a sort of satellite approach to their distribution, where they have facilities in Surat Thani and going out towards the north in Khon Kaen and out towards Chiang Mai. So roughly about sort of a 300-kilometre radius between the different ones. But recently, since the takeovers in Northern East, I haven't heard much with that respect.
And Matthew Sylvester apologises for having missed some of the presentation, saying, is the demand that they're coming is it for warehouse space built by logistics operators, so DHL, are they building themselves, or is it being built by developers and leased out to logistics operators?
That's a good question. Yeah, so we're starting to see the DHLs and the 3PLs of the world starting to see the value in real estate and are in fact looking to build their own. But we expect that trend to continue, by the way. I think that's going to be a new reality. Right now, almost entirely built by the major developers, often in conjunction or working with the 3PLs. Right now, that's a traditional landlord-tenant type of relationship, but that might change, I think, in the future. We might start to see joint ventures, for example, in that sector as the 3PLs move to develop their own and capture some of the value from their real estate.
So that's a big change. I mean, 10 years ago, all the 3PLs, third-party logistics operators, wanted to get rid of their real estate. And just at the time as logistics properties started to take off and become the sexiest asset class in the world, right?
Yeah, and they're able to they have an enormous war chest to draw upon, so they're very financially in a position to be able to do that, and also they have tenants. They can build it and use it themselves and then sell on. So that might well be a model that we'll see more of.
Now, Paul Stephen Carnell has a question saying, do you think the decline in occupancy in the central region is linked to the environment? I guess he maybe is referring to the floods of 2011, if I remember rightly. And then the second part of the question is, what about future development in the central area of the country to supply the Myanmar LBNC, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, and China, and link into the China supply chain and future infrastructure development? So are we seeing logistics centres in places like, I guess, Pitsanaluk or Korat or Konkan?
But the answer is not right now. So I've the first part of that question, is it because of the environment? Well, yeah, I think that it's almost certainly related to the flood risk, which is why people have moved away or shied away from that area. But Paul's right. I mean, that area and to the northern part does provide better access to the regional markets, and I think that as we see the development perhaps of this railway, which is going to be serving the region, we already see that railway is now connected down through to Laos. As that eventually makes its way into Thailand, we might well see more development along that railway line and in key hubs like perhaps Konkan. I believe that's where it goes through. But I mean, we might well see more warehousing there at that time, but we're still quite some time away before that railway is complete, I think.
Right, Nick Wetterwinkle's got a question. What proportion of existing industrial space in Bangkok is on land that is no longer zoned for industrial use? And given the shortage of purple zoned land that is zoned for industrial development in and around the preferred areas such as Bang Tra, when will demand be sufficient to increase rents by any significant level?
Okay, so I mean, not all warehousing has to be in industrial zoned. Okay, so the industrial zone helps for factory license, or especially if you have dangerous goods, for example, hazmats, where you're required to be in an industrial zone. Warehousing can be developed in lots of different areas, and where it can be developed is going to be subject, of course, to the local town plan, and specifically within sort of the exceptions. So of course, in the town plan, there's areas where you have prohibited uses and areas which are permitted, but under the sort of a 10% or so exceptional use, which is allowed in the town plan. Vast majority do, of course, want to be in industrial. Do we expect? I don't necessarily expect to see rents climb much higher where they are in order to get to some threshold where it's going to make sense to develop in industrial zoned land right in the heart of Bangkok. I don't think that demand's suddenly going to see rents go to 200, 300, 400 baht per square meter. I don't think that's possible. If you look at logistics rents around the world, Thailand's not cheap. We sit somewhere in the middle of that league table of about 105 or so countries. We're certainly more expensive than some markets in Australia, for example, and of course several markets in the US. So I don't think that we're going to suddenly see prime or premium warehouses attracting rents of substantially more than what we see today.
Thank you.
Not sure if I answered the question.
One more question from me, just give other people a chance to type in their questions. Do you think that with the entry of new players, that there is a possibility of maybe oversupply if they build speculatively? Or do you think these new players, I think we mentioned Sansiri and Origin, do you think they will follow the same build to suit model to try and de-risk the development process?
So far, that seems to be the case. I think the big attraction, I think, for logistics is that build to suit model. The lower risk development, I think, is one of the major appeals for logistics. If we see many come in, then the risk of oversupply is always there, of course, with more and more speculative development. But I think that I don't think that's very likely. I think the appeal of custom-built facilities to the occupier as well as the owner, I think, is just too strong to ignore.
Tamon 120 has put an interesting question in. It says, do you have any research related to self-storage warehouses? And is there really any demand for this kind of warehouse in Bangkok? And we've seen several people set these up. After a lot of PR and talk, the growth seems quite slow from my amateur observation of it. Whereas you on the expert side, what do you think?
Well, we don't. Unfortunately, we don't have any research specifically covering that sector. I only know sort of anecdotally, but we do see much more growth in that sector. The iStore, I think, is one which immediately jumps out as one which has been seeing substantial growth as well as investment, and I believe that they also had a partnership with one of the other major developers, and again in the region, the self-storage sector is viewed as very much an institutional asset. So you've got major players like Warburg Pincus who are investing heavily in self-storage. In Thailand, still relatively minimal market penetration, but if we're going to follow the regional trends, then I would expect that to grow.
And I've got a question from Beata. She put it on the chat thing, so I haven't got your full name, Beata. And how's the FZ warehouses? FZ presumably free zone.
Free zone.
And is there a market there or not really for warehousing within FZs or FZs, or however you like to pronounce it?
Yeah. I mean, free zone warehousing. But I mean, there hasn't been all that much development specifically for warehousing in free zones. Now, of course, there's other alternatives, which perhaps are going to be a little bit more flexible, such as bonded warehouses. So it's quite possible to take a standalone warehouse and make that a bonded warehouse. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in a free zone. That gives some advantages, I think, because you're then not limited to being inside a designated free zone in a particular industrial state. Both of those free zone facility or the bonded warehouse facilities could be anywhere where warehousing development is permitted. But yeah, nothing specifically in the free zone. Not much. It's primarily manufacturing going to be in free zones, I think.
Thank you. Peter Johansson asked, how large are the investments by Chinese companies, and do you see major growth there? There's been a lot of talk about Chinese investment in real estate in Thailand. We had seen people speculatively buying individual condominium units. Very little Chinese investment in offices or hotels. And have you seen any real Chinese investment in the logistics sector?
Some. So the kind of related to the e-commerce story, right? So the major e-commerce players also tend to have their own logistics arms as well. So excuse my pronunciation, but Cainiao, which is the or Cainiao, which is the logistics arm for Alibaba, which is of course related to Lazada. They have been looking into joint ventures, I think, with WHA. We also know that other companies who are also pretty significant players are actively seeking out JV opportunities. So there is a lot of interest, lots of money to spend. Just it's about finding the appropriate avenue as a foreign investor for them to participate in this market. If you're an operator, it's very easy to get board of investment approval to go and buy land and build. But of course, if you're a developer or investor, that avenue is somewhat closed unless you have a JV partner.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, just to give just another minute or so if anyone else has got any questions. So overall, Marcus, do you just see that there's just likely to be steady growth, where it's maybe not much speculative development, mainly driven by build to suit. Still the same old areas of everybody wants to be in Samut Prakan, Chao Chang Sao, Bang Natran area. That's the hot spot. Eastern Seaboard's not very exciting, and not much in the central area. Is that the sort of summary?
So yeah, in summary, yeah, but I think that sums it up pretty well. And yeah, I think that's the it's the resilience of that sector. I mean, it doesn't change all that much, and in today's turbulent times, I think that might be a blessing.
Okay, well, I think unless anyone else has got any questions, I haven't seen any come up on my screen yet. I think just we maybe wrap it up and let everyone get on with, we're trying to make some money, trying to run your businesses. So big thank you on behalf of the British Chamber of Commerce Property and Infrastructure Group to Marcus for a great presentation. As always, it's always good to hear from someone who really knows what's going on in the market. I always learn something new. Just on the Property and Infrastructure Group, we're always looking for new topics, particularly with new topics where someone knows a good speaker like Marcus, who can really tell us what's going on. So if any of the people attending today do have suggestions on whether they want to speak or whether they know someone who'd be a good speaker, please let me or Greg Watkins know so that we continue our series of webinars and hopefully finally some live events from the British Chamber of Commerce Property and Infrastructure Group. So on that note, have a great week and look after yourself, be safe, and good luck for the business for the rest of the year. And a big thank you, Marcus, for your attending today and your great presentation.
Thank you, James. Goodbye, everyone. Take care.